The reason thoroughness is important is because every single link in the prosecutorial chain must be strong. It needs to be strong because trying this case will not be an easy thing. Winning a conviction will be hard. In fact, County Attorney Freeman is the only prosecutor in the state of Minnesota who has successfully convicted a police officer for murder. And he can tell you that it's hard. I say this not because we doubt our resources or our ability. In fact, we're confident in what we're doing. But history does show that there are clear challenges here.
That was Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison at a press conference announcing 3 more officers were charged in George Floyd's death, along with the additional charges for the officer who put his knee on his neck.
National Affairs correspondent for the Nation, John Nichols, had an exclusive and wide-ranging interview with Attorney General Ellison, and he joins us now to talk about some of the top takeaways from that. John, it's always great to see you.
Good to see you, John.
Pleasure to be with you both. Good to see you.
Keith Ellison really is a movement person. He's been a Bernie Sanders supporter, so that's sort of the wing of the Democratic Party that he comes from. What did you make of your conversation with him? What did you think were some of the most important takeaways?
I appreciate the question. It was a remarkable interview, I think, if you know the context of contemporary American politics. Democratic elected officials at high levels, especially attorneys general, tend to be relatively cautious in their language. Now, I would not suggest for a moment that Keith Ellison lacked caution or responsibility, but his blunt approach to the issues of police brutality and the need to change policing was striking. He began with a contextual statement. I asked him about, how we should be thinking about this, and he suggested that in a just society where your major issues have been resolved, then policing can indeed play a guardian role and a role that many people might find acceptable. But in an unjust society, and he was specifically referenced the history of slavery, segregation, crackdowns on labor rights, crackdowns on communities. He said policing becomes an enforcer of a social hierarchy. And if we understand it in that context, then the brutality becomes a huge issue, not merely because of the precise incidents that we're talking about, not merely because of its prevalence in society, but also because of what it says. It is effectively reinforcing a host of injustices. So it was really quite remarkable framing. And from there, he talked a great deal about the need to address police brutality in very clear and direct ways, but also to address broader questions of how policing goes forward in contemporary American society. It was a rare interview, and I'm pleased to talk to him about it.
I have that first initial quote in front of me that I think is really striking as well. So let me just read it. You ask him about, what do you put this in context as police brutality? And he says, well, you know that the police are now and have always been in place to maintain the legal social order. If that's a just social order, that's one thing. If it's one based on slavery, Jim Crow segregation, capital and big business abusing labor, then the police have always played this role where they are the ones who sort of maintain that social hierarchy. So Sagar, really interesting context that he starts with there, looking not just at the specific instances, because sometimes the conversation can narrow to just like, let's have specific police reforms, which I support, but you have to look at the context of the entire society within which that policing exists.
Yeah, and John, just to get your perspective, I would love to, from that news conference in Keith Ellison actually charging Officer Chauvin, upgrading the charge to second-degree murder and charging the others. One of the things that I'm actually a little worried about, and I heard from some legal experts, is that heightens the burden of proof, and that it's quite difficult, as Keith Ellison alluded to in that press conference, to actually convict police officers in the court of law. Have you done any thinking about this, or did you talk to him about that at all?
Look, I have talked to him about it some. We actually had a
Yeah.
number of conversations over several days, and he is very conscious of the challenges here and very conscious of the history. In fact, if you a little later in the interview, he goes through the names of African American men who have died at the hands of police officers and the many, many challenges in getting convictions, even having charges brought, the issue of hung juries in many of these cases. So he's well aware of that, and I think we all are. And at the same time, there is a sense that the justice system has not functioned well, that it has not done its job. And I would suggest, and I'm not going to put words in Keith Ellison's mouth, but I would suggest that we're at a point in history where an effort has to be made to sort of break the pattern. And part of breaking the pattern is to charge appropriately and to bring the full resources of the legal entity that's bringing it, be it a DA's office or the state attorney general's office, to bear, to make the effort. And yes, it is a challenging job. But, one of the things that I say about our politics so often is that a history of pulling punches, a history of compromising and not doing what is appropriate begins to lock in. And I would suggest that at this point, Keith Ellison, from a very sound legal standpoint and from a very serious legal and societal concern, is choosing to charge appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's remarkable to have someone with his perspective in such a critical position of power. One of the things that also struck me in your conversation with him, which was just so thoughtful on a variety of levels, is he talks about how, yes, and I'll read his quote, "There's no doubt that there's a disproportionate number of people of color impacted negatively by police community engagements. But the fact that we don't talk about the white victims means that we racialize this thing to the point that there are people who don't think that it's a prevailing American problem. It is." Speak to that, because I think that class dynamic, obviously the race dynamic is clear and something that we've all been witnessing on camera, but there's a class dynamic as well, and I think his point is really an important one.
Well, this is Keith Ellison. I mean, he is someone who has been involved in politics for a long time. He came into politics as an ally and supporter of Paul Wellstone back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And one of the significant things about him is that he has always sought to build coalitions to address economic and social and racial injustice. And in this case, when he came in as Attorney General, long before the death of George Floyd, he set up a commission or set up an internal inquiry to look at police-involved killings and incidents of violence around Minnesota, studied it statewide. And one of his purposes there was to get the data, to get the facts. And as he says, the facts showed him what he had always suspected, that police-involved killings, police-involved incidents of violence don't just strike one community. You can find them in many, many places in rural areas and urban areas. And that really what you have to do is recognize first and foremost the disproportional impact on the African American community. You don't, try to water that down or deny it. But once you have acknowledged that, then you must also tell folks, hey, this occurs in a lot of other places as well. And if we're going to get this thing right, if we're going to move forward as a society, and understand what needs to be done, then we need to build a great coalition, a massive coalition that says policing can and should be different.
Well, really appreciate your perspective. It was a great interview, John. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great
I appreciate it.
See you later.
Thank you.
And we'll have more rising for you after this.